We take solidarity with Christchurch.
Near London's Finsbury Park Mosque this evening, a vigil to pay tribute to the lives lost in Christchurch, but also to reflect on the atmosphere that gave rise to yet another deadly attack on Muslims.
They are attacking us because of our faith, because we are Muslim.
It's racism and it's about hating.
It's all about Islamophobia, because all what you see in the news, all what you see, it's negative about Islam.
Just around the corner from here is the site of another deadly attack 2 years ago, highlighting what experts call a wave of hate targeting Muslims.
A crowd of worshippers run over by a Muslim-hating extremist in a van. That attack was on the minds of many today as police stepped up patrols outside Britain's mosques. Muslim adults here are more likely than anyone else to be the targets of racially motivated crime, and that ugly trend crosses borders.
People were very nervous, very emotional.
Many say it's partly enabled by politicians themselves. Look at the quotes from an Australian senator shared again and again. While Muslims may have been the victims today, he wrote, usually they're the perpetrators. And then there's policy. Remember Donald Trump's contested travel ban targeting Muslim-majority countries.
I think Islam hates us.
To be very careful in the language we use and the messages we amplify.
London's first Muslim mayor, Sadiq Khan, is the constant target of online threats, including yesterday from one of the apparent attackers in New Zealand.
There are some people who, rather than addressing people's fears, play on them. You have a role to play in radicalizing people to become terrorists.
Shame on them!
The intense burst of hate in Christchurch has led to ripples even this far away. Thomas Dagg, CBC News, London.
Causing as much hateful damage as possible seemed to be the shooter's goal, and he's not alone in that. Many who study radical ideologies worry that far-right extremism is not taken seriously enough, especially online. Joining me now, three people who closely follow this kind of rhetoric online. Kathleen Belew, she's a historian of paramilitary and white nationalist movement. She's in Chicago. Irfan Chowdhury, a hate crimes researcher and head of the Office of Human Rights at MacEwan University. He's in Edmonton. And Ishmael Darrow is a digital editor at Democracy Now! And has covered online right-wing extremism for BuzzFeed News. And he's in New York tonight. Thanks all of you for being here. Let's just start with what you have seen and heard from the shooter over the past 24 hours or so. What that has told you about who he is, and I guess how you would characterize right-wing extremism and the movement that he seems to be a part of. I'll start with you, Kathleen.
So immediately, the manifesto and the words that this person wrote on the magazines and gun stocks point to a deep affiliation with the white power movement, which is a broad-based social movement in the United States and beyond that cohered after the Vietnam War, swelled in the 1980s and early 1990s, and has included large acts of violence with the Oklahoma City bombing and then several other acts in the recent past here. I think what we see from this is renewed affirmation that this is a transnational movement and that we need to be thinking about these acts of violence as interconnected, particularly given that we've now seen 3 attacks or attempted attacks even in the last 6 months.
And I'm using these words, white supremacy and extreme right wing, but obviously fundamentally the shooter is a terrorist, Irfan. So what stood out for you in terms of the hints or clues that he may have left even in the manifesto about who he is and what ideology, if we can call it that, he espouses?
There was definitely strong, coherent connections to right-wing extremism, white supremacy. Within the manifesto itself, he does reference the 14 words, which is usually, really strongly connected to the white supremacy movement, and that refers to we must secure the future for our white children. And so I think those aspects where you see the narrative being very direct and very specific in terms of the language being used. What also struck me the most in terms of the manifesto was just the way it was written, and clearly the style was meant to evoke some kind of an emotion from folks who are reading it to try to inspire them to do something similar, and him being as a model of what you might be able to do to what he wanted to essentially do in terms of reverse what he's seeing as a infestation of immigrants.
And Ishmael, I guess that manifesto was also supposed to sort of mislead people who don't have a strong connection to 8chan, this sort of underground forum, or to any of the ideas that he was talking about.
He clearly wanted maximum exposure and he wanted maximum virality. So while I think legitimately explaining some of his worldview and the fact that he is driven by fears about Muslims and the so-called Great Replacement, which is this conspiracy theory about Muslims taking over Western countries, he also places some landmines, so to speak, about different in-jokes and online references and memes, in a way trolling. So I think it's very important that as we come to grips with what's happened here, that we are mindful of the messaging around this. This was live streamed on Facebook. He left breadcrumbs on various social media platforms. It's clear that he wanted as much attention as possible. And unfortunately, we do have to talk about it and we have to address it, but we have to, I think, be mindful of how we do it and not to basically follow the narrative that he was hoping for.
So Kathleen, does that surprise you, the way this was orchestrated in terms of information, the use of social media, the way he seemed to coordinate the physical attack with what was happening online?
I think the new part here is the viral video element of it, the live streaming. But no, this is a movement that has been using social media organizing and using the internet and the proto-internet since the early 1980s. The White Power movement went online with a series of code word access message boards in 1983-84 with LibertyNet. So this is a movement that has been successfully mobilizing through social networking long before Facebook. They're many generations into this as a strategy for their activism.
So given that, Irfan, and given the fact that certainly the shooter or the other two people that have been detained were not on any security watch list, what does that tell us about the ability to monitor that kind of talk online?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a huge gap there in terms of just the overwhelmingness of the information that has to be sifted through. You hear examples of Facebook hiring a number of contractors to try to be that, space where folks can document and report things, and then Facebook will check it against their terms of reference to see if it violates that and remove it accordingly. And I think the biggest piece around monitoring is, for every one group you might be aware of or overt thing you might be aware of, there's so many covert ways that some of these messages can sift through that it's really difficult to even start to address it from a manageable way. And so I think that's the biggest challenge. The other piece, just connected to your question, also reflects in terms of where the focus for law enforcement and government entities have been. Echoing a comment earlier is, we have seen these groups quite active in the 80s and even 90s, but then a sense of disorganization, especially in the Canadian context, occurred where they almost fell off the radar for our different levels of national security organizations. And I think as a result, they've kind of been able to go under the radar over the last number of years, especially because the focus has been so much on a post-9/11 climate.
So Ishmael, speak to that as well. I mean, yes, you expect social media platforms to shut these things down, but I mean, are they supposed to be doing the work of law enforcement, I guess?
Well, it's not just that they're being tasked with essentially law enforcement duties. They're not even doing their social media duties in many cases. They often understaff these kinds of monitoring departments. Often they're not even departments, they're all contractors, in some far-flung country where maybe they're not even speaking the native language of what these posts are. And often companies like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, where this kind of extremism spreads, really rely on journalists and researchers to flag this stuff and to say, this is really serious. And only then will they sometimes, moderate and ban and take the action that hopefully they would have taken proactively.
So let me just do one quick go around from everybody on this. What does this attack that does seem different in nature because of this social media element, what is there already something that you're thinking about in terms of things that could be done differently, lessons we should take from this, or something that's missing in terms of this conversation already? Kathleen?
Yeah, the really big one is that we have to think about this not as a lone wolf action or one person in any sense. This is part of a coherent social movement with a coherent ideology. And when ideology motivates violence, we don't have to think about violence as being outside of the scope of our understanding and response. There are all kinds of ways that history can inform how we might differently structure thinking about it. And one of them is just about connecting things like the Tree of Life synagogue shooting with this attack in New Zealand, with the attack in Charleston, South Carolina, perpetrated by Dylan Roof a number of years ago. And we've seen a lot of coverage where these events are broken up one from the next, and we think about them as anti-Semitism here, racism here, Islamophobia there. But all of them are motivated by the same ideology. And we have to think about this as part of a coherent social movement. As much as this movement attempts to engineer its own disappearance, we must think about it this way.
Irfan, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think just echoing similar sentiment in terms of we just look at this as individuals' acts versus seeing it from a systemic perspective, then we are missing the point. I think, how many more examples, and just to add one more in terms of Kath Leeds examples, we had the Quebec mosque shooting here in Canada. And, for me, it's a matter of saying how many more of these do we need to have until we start taking the aspect around, inherent and ingrained layers of discrimination and racism, and even to the context of Islamophobia now, to realize that this is an embedded issue that's impacting a large amount of different communities, all being fueled by similar hatreds.
Last word to you, Ishmael, on that.
There is definitely a new element in this, which is the social media angle, but echoing the other panelists, this is part of a larger trend, connecting it to Alexander Bissonnette in Quebec or Anders Breivik in Norway, and two massacres that, in fact, it seems the suspect here referenced explicitly. So it is connected to all those things. But I do think that the social media angle and the way the manifesto is written is important to take note of, because it speaks to the kind of online radicalization that happens on the far right. This language about population replacement, so-called white genocide, all these ideas about demographics and birth rates. This is, I think, probably a conversation that's been happening for a long time, but online it is incredible. From my own reporting and from researchers I've talked to, anti-Muslim sentiment is just the glue that holds together so many other kinds of reactionary far-right politics, from misogynists to white nationalists. It seems like the bedrock similarity there is there's always anti-Muslim animus, and this language really is toxic, and it is, I'm afraid, increasingly becoming mainstreamed in our politics as well.
Kathleen, Ishmael, Irfan, thank you all very much. It's been a difficult day, and we do appreciate you trying to bring some perspective to all of this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.